Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Pineo, and my pronouns are she, her. I am a 23-year-old woman, and I have glasses and red hair that I'm wearing tied back. I'm wearing a purple shirt and a purple sweater, and my background is a speckled tan virtual background. I am a white, cisgender, disabled, late diagnosed autistic woman. As I film this video, I would like to acknowledge the Susquehannock and their indigenous kin and neighbors on whose traditional territories I live and work. Because my work was undertaken during my studies with the University of Maryland, I would also like to now read the University of Maryland's land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who are the ancestral stewards of this sacred land. It is their historical responsibility to advocate for the four-legged, the winged, and those that crawl and those that swim. They remind us that clean air and pristine waterways are essential to all life. This land acknowledgement is a vocal reminder for each of us as two-leggeds to ensure our physical environment is in better condition than what we inherited, for the health and prosperity of future generations. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about symbolic annihilation and disabled individuals' perceptions of music archives. I'll start by talking through my methods and some framing topics. Then we'll get right into my findings. My findings are broken up, more or less, into three categories. How are users using archives? Perceptions of historical music figures, expectations for representation and reality, and who are our users, really? After that, I'll talk through the significance of those findings and conclude with some final thoughts. While investigating these questions, I encountered a great deal of literature on diversity movements in archives. But there wasn't a lot out there about disability that didn't focus on legal compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or take on a sort of this is how you can interact with a disabled user approach. But Dr. Grayson Brillmeyer's work, which we'll talk more about in a moment, opened up a new path. Their work focuses on erased or partial narratives of disabled people in archival and historical material, which, as you'll soon learn, was vitally interesting to me. Within the broader literature, I also found a great deal of discussion of reparative description work. The aim of this type of archival work is to repair the harms caused by centuries of inequity in archival description. Language use is a major part of how that harm is addressed. But we also need to understand what caused that harm in the first place. And that's where Dr. Michelle Caswell's work on symbolic annihilation becomes relevant. The term symbolic annihilation was first used by George Gerbner in 1972 to describe the absence of a particular group, especially gender, racial, or sexual minorities, from media, and the ways in which that absence can erase them from public consciousness. But in the archives world, it was popularized by Dr. Caswell and her co-authors, who define it as, quote, how members of marginalized communities feel regarding the absence or misrepresentation of their communities in archival collection policies, in descriptive tools, and or in collections themselves, end quote. The antidote to symbolic annihilation is representational belonging. Caswell and her co-authors define that as, quote, the ways in which community archives empower people marginalized by mainstream media outlets and memory institutions with the autonomy and authority to establish, enact, and reflect on their presence in ways that are complex, meaningful, substantive, and positive to them in a variety of symbolic contexts, end quote. This is what archivists ought to strive toward in their collections and actions for all marginalized groups. Next, there's also the issue of anticipatory erasure. Returning now to the work of Dr. Brillmeyer, anticipatory erasure is an expectation of encountering, quote, erasure in archival material, end quote. It, quote, expands the scope of symbolic annihilation in archives in ways unique to disability and ableism. Individuals not only feel their erasure in history, but also deeply know the different forms of erasure of disability in archives in such a way that they anticipate encountering them. This adds an additional affective dimension of anticipation, which is informed by the symbolic annihilation that they may have experienced before in archives and in life, that forms their imaginaries around future experiences, end quote. Next, is access fatigue. Access fatigue, as defined by Anika Conrad, is, quote, the everyday pattern of constantly needing to help others participate in access, a demand so taxing and so relentless that at times it makes access simply not worth the effort, unquote. Building on this concept, Dr. Bromeyer has extended conversations around academic ableism to the archival space. In particular, they have called the accumulated sense of unbelonging gathered emotionally expensive. In doing so, they point out that symbolic annihilation of disabled people in archives is not limited to the contents of the collections themselves, but through the inaccessibility of the collections, disabled people also become symbolically annihilated from the archive space itself. Finally, the last important piece of framing comes in the form of language choices. In referring to disability, there are two primary types of phrasing you can use: person-first language and identity-first language. Person-first looks like this: person with a disability. And identity-first looks like this: disabled person. Person-first is usually seen today as medicalizing disability because it separates the person from their disability, whereas identity-first is seen as embracing the identity of disabled because it incorporates the state of being disabled as a positive characteristic, like being kind or generous. For example, we say person with cancer, person first, because that's a negative disease to have. But once a person has beaten cancer, they become a cancer survivor, identity first again. Additionally, as you can see from the bar chart presented on this slide from a study conducted by Ather Sharif and his co-authors in 2022, identity-first language is the overall preference of the international surveyed members of the disability community, with 42% of respondents preferring it, 38% preferring person-first, and 20% having no preference between the two. For those reasons, for this presentation, I'll be using identity-first language. Now, language tends to go hand in hand with culture. So let's also take a moment to discuss disability culture. Culture itself is difficult to define, and I don't purport to offer a single all-encompassing definition here. For the purposes of this discussion, I turn to the symbolic anthropological tradition, which understands culture today as a taken for granted set of behaviors and understandings that make up a social world. Like any other nation or culture, that of disability culture has many, many subcultures. Like any literal nation with citizens, to understand disability culture as any single unit is a mistake. When we think of disability culture as a more literal culture, it's easier to see the subgroups within it as natural cultural variations, to understand the vital importance of linguistic debates, and to comprehend the harm ableism does on a daily basis. For an archivist, disability culture is particularly important to understand because history creates culture and culture creates history, and history is, after all, the primary purview of an archivist. It's a cyclic process. And this brings me to my project itself. My methods for the survey were as follows. On October 3rd, 2022, I received IRB approval for a public online survey of disabled individuals' perceptions of music archives, and it ran between October 7th and November 30th, 2022. Prior to launching the survey, I piloted it with 5 people between September 12th and 21st, 2022. Once it launched, participants took the survey on Qualtrics, and it ran, depending on their selections, somewhere between 15 and 45 multiple choice and open-ended questions. Only questions that determined the flow of the survey were required. At the end of each block of quantitative questions, participants had the opportunity to provide additional written detail about their responses if they chose to. In order to get at the topic of symbolic annihilation without my participants necessarily knowing the phrase or anything about it from a scholarly standpoint, I also asked questions about how accurately represented they felt in archival materials and the amount of disability material encountered in archives, then how those two realities affected their overall perceptions of music and non-music archives. I also posed questions that explored the impacts of symbolic annihilation by asking whether or not increased access to materials describing well-known musical figures as disabled would change their perception of them. I drew my participant pool from online communities on Reddit and Facebook for musicians or disabled individuals, email listservs at universities and colleges, and personal connections. There were 177 overall participants. After the survey closed, I began to analyze it using SPSS. To analyze written responses, I engaged in inductive qualitative coding from a grounded theory perspective. I also generated word clouds. To analyze numeric responses, I focused primarily on preliminary analysis like frequency counts, and my overall approach was descriptivist and interpretivist. Turning now to my findings, the majority of my survey participants, roughly a third, were neurodivergent, and within that group, the majority of them were either autistic or ADHD. This word cloud shows the responses to a voluntary question asking about the nature of the respondent's disability. This is an interesting majority, and it deserves some follow-up study. Is it that archives attract neurodivergent users? Is it that they dissuade use by individuals who are disabled in other ways, making neurodivergent users the most successful at overcoming systemic barriers to access? Or is it something else entirely, like that more autistic people or those who have ADHD answered this question in particular? That remains to be seen. Speaking now to participants' perceptions of music and non-music archives, in the bar chart now on the left of the screen, you can see that the majority of participants, 27, rated the perception of non-music archives as somewhat positive on a 5-point scale from extremely negative to extremely positive. The next most populous category is neither positive or negative with 16. Unfortunately, participants rated their perceptions of music archives lower. As you can see in bar chart now on the right of the screen, the majority of participants, 33, said that their perception was neither positive or negative. The next most populous category, somewhat positive, has 15. This is an interesting trend. In fact, disabled musicians reported feeling less well represented than disabled people in music archives. As you can see from the bar chart on the left of the screen, disabled musicians reported feeling not at all accurately represented with 24 counts. Disabled people, on the other hand, as you can see from the bar chart now on the right of the screen, reported feeling slightly accurately represented. While neither group reported feeling well represented, it's intriguing that the disabled musicians should feel less well represented than disabled people in music archives, of all places. This suggests that the greater a focus on music an archive has, the less well represented participants felt, and thus the lower perception participants held of it. This needs more research because if this trend holds in larger sample sizes, it's very worrying. Now, returning to Dr. Bromeyer's concept of anticipatory erasure, this bar chart shows that 15 respondents anticipated finding no materials about disabled individuals in a music archive, 12 anticipated finding a little, and 1 anticipated finding either a moderate or great deal. This is anticipatory erasure at work, and it is unjust. Disabled users should be able to access a music archive and expect to find materials about disabled musicians. Turning now to the idea of perception, overall, survey participants seem to be thinking about non-music and music archives differently. As you can see from the word cloud on the left, in which the primary words are collect, thing, place, history, and record, when asked to describe what a non-music archive is in their own words, participants gravitated toward words that focus not so much on the oldness of the items an archive might hold, but on the collection and preservation of the items. That is, participants did not seem to default to the archives as dusty boxes in a basement stereotype. However, when asked what the first 5 words were that came to mind when thinking of a music archive, as displayed in the word cloud on the right, the most common word by far was old, followed by historic, music, digital, and classic. Digital is also displayed much more prominently in the music archive word cloud than in the non-music archive word cloud, suggesting that participants perceive music archives as based on digital files, if not primarily an online phenomenon. To that point, general archives have a greater emphasis on the word place, potentially suggesting a greater tie to physical locations. Thus, music archives for the participants seem to deal with older yet digitized materials, while archives in general seem to deal with collecting and preserving materials. While these two processes are by no means mutually exclusive, it's interesting to see which parts of the process are emphasized based on the institution's primary purpose, that is, music or general. Participants do seem to use music and non-music archives differently when it comes to in-person and virtual modalities. 36 participants use non-music archives both in person and online, while only 29 participants used non-music archives only online. But when it came to music archives, a far greater majority used them only online. 21 used them exclusively online, while only 7 used them both in person and online. Speaking now to representation itself. When asked how accurately they felt represented as a disabled person in non music archives on a 5-point scale from not at all accurately to extremely accurately, 50 of 53 respondents said that they felt somewhere between not at all accurately represented and moderately accurately represented. Next, when asked how accurately they felt represented as a disabled person in music archives, on that same 5-point scale, 21 of 24 people said they felt somewhere between not at all accurately represented and moderately accurately represented. Then, when asked about how well represented they felt in music archives as a disabled person with a relationship to music, 25 of 28 people said that they felt somewhere between not at all accurately represented and somewhat represented. Finally, when asked about how represented they felt as a disabled musician in archival records, 50 out of 53 people again said they felt somewhere between not at all accurately represented and moderately accurately represented. It's counterintuitive that a musician should feel less accurately represented in a music archive than a general one. Yet this is the reality in which we seem to find ourselves. While the sample size in this section is, at times, small, it's worth deeper exploration of the topics found here. Disabled musicians should be able to reliably turn to music archives as sources of information on their own histories and see their own experiences reflected back to them. Anticipatory erasure should not be occurring here. But in some ways, this reality is unsurprising, given that archives are not generally constructed physically or otherwise with an embodied experience of disability in mind, making access itself a challenge. Participants in my survey responded to a question asking how well their archives met their accessibility needs in many ways. But in the qualitative follow up space, a different story emerged. Most participants gave a follow up response that echoed the sentiment articulated by one participant: I get by. By that, some meant that their disability didn't always directly impact archival work. Some meant that their disability did impact it, but that they had developed their own ways of accommodating themselves without the assistance of archival staff. Some meant that they had figured out accommodations with the help of archival staff, and others meant something else. But regardless of what exactly they were getting at, responses that conveyed the sentiment of I get by evoked a tired and resigned air that expressed both the physical and emotional work that goes into being disabled in a world that simply isn't made for disabled people. They expected not to be accommodated in an archival setting, and they made do in that reality because it was the one they expected to live in. In 2023, that is an unacceptably low bar. In the digital age, it was unsurprising that another common trend was an expressed need for more digital copies of items for use with programs like screen readers, text to speech software, or Zoom software. A few deaf and hard of hearing participants also expressed the need for digitized audio files that they could easily download onto their own devices for use with their own implants or other hearing devices without needing to specially request them. Previous research done by George Gerbner, Michelle Caswell, Grayson Brillmeyer, and Sarah White has made clear that one of the most effective ways to combat symbolic annihilation is to expand collections or to reevaluate materials in existing collections. This data supports that conclusion. It also makes clear the importance of telling complex narratives about historical figures and of not reducing the aesthetic of disability to harmful stereotypes. Combined, these findings reflect what many musicians know from personal experience. Symbolic annihilation has created a reality in which disabled musicians' histories and experiences have been hidden from view. Archival users are tired of this reality, and they feel the emotional toll of it. It's up to each individual archival institution what they will do to address this reality. One idea: if archives were to have more records about disabled figures, the impacts of anticipatory erasure and symbolic annihilation would be lessened. but so too could they influence the perceptions of particular historical figures. In order to test this idea, I wanted to know how each of four musical figures, Ludwig van Beethoven, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Amy Beach, and Ray Charles, would be perceived by disabled people who self identified as having some sort of tie to music in their life. In particular, I wanted to know whether these figures would be perceived as disabled, and if having archival evidence, whether in the form of records, finding aids, or something else, that these individuals were disabled would alter their perception of them in some way. I intentionally chose these four for a number of reasons. First, I anticipated that my participants would be largely English speaking. For better or worse, archives in the English speaking world are largely spaces that deal with the Western art canon, meaning that figures like Beethoven, Mozart, and Beach would likely be represented within them. Second, Charles is a recognizable popular figure, as are Beethoven and Mozart. Third, the narratives around Beethoven and Charles tend to be defined by their respective disabilities, while Beach's and Mozart's disabilities are only illicitly speculated about. I was curious to see how participants' responses would align with these broader narrative tendencies. Were participants looking for ways to engage with their own histories, to find figures like them? Were they also tired of the silence that has sprung up around disability in musical figures? Or had the silence in symbolic annihilation done its work? Did they know the histories were there to be found in the first place? Participants' answers largely reflected what might be expected given the general public knowledge of each figure. For example, when asked if they thought of Beethoven as disabled, most of my respondents said yes. Yet this word cloud shows the frequency of descriptors respondents used for Beethoven. You'll notice that the word they used most often overall was deaf, but they never actually used disabled. Other large words include piano, classic, music, old, composer, genius, and man. So, as we can see here, Beethoven was not perceived as disabled, but only as deaf. Participants referred to him in their qualitative answers as, quote, the deaf composer, end quote. That is, Beethoven became defined only by his specific disability, not a full complex human who's disabled. Moreover, there's a very fine line between embracing a disability identity and reducing an individual to it. In Beethoven's case, narratives tended to fall toward the latter. But that narrative of overcoming an audiological disability in order to compose great music is simple, and it's hurtful. Disabled individuals do not need to overcome any part of themselves. Beethoven did not overcome his disability in order to compose his Symphony No. 9, as is often implied. Rather, he drew on his plentiful compositional skills and experience and used the unique accommodations he had rigged up for himself in order to compose it. He was still disabled throughout the process. Failing to acknowledge that vital part of Beethoven's identity is harmful, and we'll return to the importance of it at the end of this presentation. Unlike Beethoven, when asked whether they thought of Mozart as disabled, most respondents answered that they did not. For many, his inclusion in this discussion might come as something of a surprise. He's not a figure most of us think of as disabled in any way. But Mozart, as related to us by first-hand accounts, particularly his letters, displayed clear traits of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. If you'd like more information on why scholars believe this, I would encourage you to look through the bibliography at the end of this presentation. I should also emphasize here that a posthumous diagnosis of most disabilities, including ASD, is impossible. That's not what I attempt to do here. Instead, I wish to do what so many have done in the realms of gender or sexuality and speculate as to the reality a historical figure inhabited in the hopes of crafting a fuller, more accurate picture of the life that individual led. Moreover, I hope to create a present day in which young musicians can look to the past and see themselves reflected there. When we turn away even from discussing the idea that our great musical figures were disabled, we erase not only their potential status as disabled figures, but disability itself from what is considered acceptable musical history. Returning to the task at hand, as you can see from the word cloud now on screen, participants primarily describe Mozart as classic. Other large words include piano, music, old, composer, prodigy, and talent. No disability-related words emerge in Mozart's word cloud. This suggests that the general public, even those who identify as disabled, are either unaware of the scholarly speculation surrounding Mozart's disability status, or they don't readily affiliate him with it. which is intriguing because a number of participants did specifically mention his disability status in their qualitative responses. Moving now to Amy Beach, she has two word clouds because many participants who answered the questions the clouds are based on use the phrase, I don't know, or the acronym IDK in the response. The word cloud generator I used did not handle that well. So, as you can now see, the most common words became dawn from don't, no, and IDK, which weren't helpful. In order to get more useful information from the survey data, I replaced responses that used I don't know or IDK with a single word unknown, then regenerated the word cloud. As you can now see, the largest word is unknown, and some of the other large words are shell, palm, oyster, origin, and soup. I speculate that those have more to do with free word association with Beach's last name, that is, because they're connected to the location of a beach, than with Beach herself, because Beach isn't really known for her connection to anything like seashells, palm trees, or oyster soup. When asked if they thought of Beach as disabled, all but 6 respondents answered that they didn't know who she was. Finally, Ray Charles is perhaps the most unique figure of the 4 I asked participants to describe, in that he was the most recent performer among them. As you can see in his word cloud, in which the largest word is blind, followed by piano, no, jazz, soul, black, sunglasses, and blue, similar to Beethoven, participants identified him with his particular disability, that is, being blind, but they didn't identify him here as disabled. When asked directly if they thought of Charles as disabled, the majority of respondents did, however, identify him as disabled. Archives and archival records are uniquely situated at the beginning of the historical narrative framing process to change how we talk about historical figures. Indeed, the majority of my participants indicated that their perception of these 4 musical figures would be changed if presented with archival records describing them as disabled. Archival records can change users' perceptions of people and historical figures. That is not a power to be taken lightly. Let us wield it responsibly and intentionally. Let us wield it factually. But in order to do that, more archival records and materials that accurately describe disabled figures and histories are clearly needed. If they are present, more individuals are likely to encounter them and learn from them. They are more likely to recognize the disabled or potentially disabled figures described in them as disabled. And through increased familiarity with disability, they'd be more likely to take on anti-ableist perspectives. All of this would go a long way toward decreasing symbolic annihilation and increasing representational belonging. Now, returning to symbolic annihilation itself, when we look at what's going on with these musical figures and how participants are talking about them, it becomes clear that there's something interesting going on here. For example, in the cases of Beethoven and Mozart, their lives have been well documented. It can't be argued that they are symbolically annihilated individuals. However, portions of their respective disability identities have undoubtedly been erased. You'll remember that symbolic annihilation refers specifically to a community. These single individuals aren't a community, and a portion of their identity certainly isn't. But this process is clearly related to symbolic annihilation. So, a portion of their identity being affected requires new terminology. Therefore, I invoke a new term. Phrasal symbolic annihilation. Why phrasal? In music, a phrase is like a sentence, and a musical piece is like a speech. The speech might make enough sense with a sentence missing that no one notices it missing at first. But once they notice it missing and replace it, the speech can't be read or understood without it anymore. Likewise, when a phrase is taken out of a piece, it can't be argued that the whole piece has been played or heard because part of it is missing, whether acknowledged or not. But when listeners hear the whole piece, they hear the whole narrative of the piece and nothing is erased. It's the same with people. Where symbolic annihilation would refer to the entire community's annihilation, phrasal symbolic annihilation would refer to the annihilation of single individuals within that community, or even portions of a single individual's history and experiences. Let's say that there was a community of people who love French fries. Symbolic annihilation would refer to the annihilation of an entire community from archival collection policies to descriptive tools or collections. Phrasal symbolic annihilation, on the other hand, would refer to the annihilation of a particular French fry lover or that person's identity as a French fry lover. Thus, phrasal comes from the musical term phrase, and it conveys the intrinsic nature of the identity component being annihilated while maintaining the emphasis on the incompleteness of the process, incomplete because the whole individual has not been symbolically annihilated. We can combat phrasal symbolic annihilation in much the same way we would combat symbolic annihilation itself. Just like adding a phrase of music or speech back into its whole, we can add the phrase of a person back into the narrative of their life. In fact, archivists are in a unique position to spread awareness of such speculation in places like biographical and historical notes. And we should take advantage of that, because as we've seen, when users aren't reflected in an archive's materials, their perceptions of that archive are affected. Moving into the conclusion section, the findings of my survey show how disabled individuals with ties to music perceive the representation of disability and disabled figures in music and non-music archives, and how that impacts their overall perceptions of those archival spaces. My research also expands on that previously done on symbolic annihilation in a number of ways. In a literal sense, it expands the discussion to a larger sample size, 177 as opposed to the previous 10 and 11. More broadly, this work also adds to understandings of symbolic annihilation itself. Not only do we have symbolic annihilation, but I've offered up the idea of phrasal symbolic annihilation. The logical next step is then to ask, where do we go from here? And the answer to that question is as vague as it is deceptively simple. Work against the symbolic annihilation of disabled individuals in music archives. But what does that mean? Well, we can add references to figures' disability status when relevant and well-founded, indicate who has processed or handled records or materials in order to show who has influenced or made changes to a record, use education initiatives like MLIS courses for young archivists or continuing and professional education offerings for practicing archivists. We can expand collections to either include more records about disability or locate existing records about disability and describe them as such. For music-specific collections, we can address the reality that some historical music figures were disabled in archival record descriptions, and use archival materials to perform works by disabled composers. This isn't a comprehensive list by any means, and I include it here only as a starting place. But it offers us a number of strategies for beginning to address symbolic annihilation in our collections. Many of my participants mentioned in their qualitative answers that they had never thought about this research topic before. At the close of the survey, I included a question that offered participants the opportunity to include any other thoughts or questions they might have. The question also offered to let them include a fun fact if they wanted to, and many participants did actually give me a fun fact. For instance, did you know that bats are the second largest order of mammals? 20% of all mammal species are bats. The first is rodents. Or my personal favorite, there was a spider in my loofah this morning. Responses that didn't provide fun facts tended to be deeply personal and fall into one of three categories. Those that told me they didn't understand why I was studying this topic. Those that hadn't been sure why I was studying the topic until partway through the survey, thought about it, and were now grateful to me for studying it. And those who knew exactly why I was studying this topic, had felt alone in their own thoughts about this topic prior to encountering my survey, and felt seen after participating in it. All of these responses were incredibly touching to read. The fact that my rather long survey garnered 177 participants in just over a month after sampling from just a few portions of the internet and some email lists suggests to me that this is a topic that people are ready to talk about. Work against symbolic annihilation occurring against any group is long overdue. The same is true of work against the symbolic annihilation occurring against disabled individuals in music archives. Returning to the quotation serving as the title of this presentation, general lack of representation and accessibility should not describe archives or archival spaces, and it doesn't have to. Archivists, as a general rule, are a motivated group of people willing to take on large projects, and who are generally motivated to create representative and accessible spaces for all. The issue we as a community, but especially as archivists, need to address is the symbolic annihilation of disabled people in music archives. Addressing the symbolic annihilation of disabled people, not just in music archives, but in archives writ large, isn't just beneficial to disabled people themselves. It's beneficial to everyone. Because in order to combat symbolic annihilation, we as archivists will have to rethink the very foundations of our present archival theory and practice, making them more inclusive and more just. Rethinking and restructuring the very foundations of our archival theory and practice might also create, in the words of Michelle Caswell, quote, a catalyst for a profound shift for our profession, a shift from being stuck in the status quo of routinized practice to enacting a new world of possibilities, a world where our practice, our values, and our labor are transformational, a world where archives are tools for human liberation, end quote. A world where archives are tools for human liberation. Yeah, that benefits everyone. General lack of representation and accessibility doesn't have to define or even describe our archives. So let's get to work. Thank you all so much for watching and listening. If you'd like to, please feel free to reach out to me by email at epineo@umd.edu. Again, that's epineo@umd.edu with any follow-up questions, thoughts, or general feedback. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are in the world. Goodbye.